So, can you tell us your name, how long you've lived here, where you're from, and what you now do for work?
In that order.
It doesn't matter.
My name's Zelda Hall. I come from Northern Ireland originally, and I lived in Dublin for 10 years after that, so in the south. I've been here 25 years, and my work is, I work as a psychotherapist, broadly speaking. I have my own practice in Amsterdam.
What brought you here in the first place?
A man. I'll always do it. A Dutch man. I met a Dutch man in Ireland, and I came over here because of him. We split up about 2 years later, but we're still good friends, and I'm still here. He lives in Switzerland now. Yeah.
That's great. Can you remember some things that were really unusual about the culture compared to the culture you came from? That things you had to get used to?
Well, I don't know if I'd use the term having to get used to, but when I first came to Amsterdam, but that was it was time before that I moved here, I thought it was an amazing city. I thought it was really exciting. And having come from Northern Ireland, and even the south of Ireland in the 70s was sort of dragging behind a lot of other countries in a lot of ways. So coming here was a sort of taste of freedom, and of course a lot of freely available drugs, which were quite interesting. And so I got into that, well, not majorly, but I smoked a lot of grass in the first year or so that I was here. And then the excitement wore off of that. But I loved the colour and the mix of people here, and I had been living in Dublin before that, so I was used to living in a pretty big city. But it was totally different here. It seemed to me much more free and exciting.
Do you speak Dutch?
Yes, fluently.
And when did you learn, and how did you learn Dutch?
I learned by in a very unique fashion. When I first came here, I had to earn money, and being a psychologist, I couldn't really do my work very well. So I went and worked in a factory for a year.
What kind of factory?
High pressure hoses. And I don't know how to translate the word. Snelkoppelingen. It is in Dutch, but I don't. It's
quick, fascinating
connections, quick, fast, literally. But it's not quite the right word. But in Bovenkerk, just outside of Amsterdam, so I worked there for a year, and I picked up most of my Dutch there. I worked with a guy who wanted to learn some English, so we exchanged vocabulary every day,
and you learned all the cuss words.
I did. That's the most interesting bit, of course, the bit you learn first. So. I went to a couple of classes in the Volksuniversiteit, but I found it, because I was also attempting in my personal life with my partner to try and speak Dutch. I knew quite a bit already, and I found the classes really boring. So I thought, well, learned it in daily life, really, especially working in the factory, which I really enjoyed.
Why?
Well, I can adapt easily to different surroundings, and the people were there. It was a small factory. The people were really friendly, and yeah, the guy I was working with taught me how to weld, which is useful. Not really, but I haven't welded since then. But I learned a few things I wouldn't have otherwise learned, and it also introduced me to a part of Dutch society that I probably wouldn't have been very familiar with if I hadn't worked there.
So what is shed some light on the part of Dutch society?
Yeah, how the Dutch function.
And how do they function?
Well, differently from the Irish. One of the things you were talking about the language just now, one of the things I noticed when I was learning the language, I learned a lot about myself as well, because having to speak a language that I wasn't very familiar with, I had to speak in very short sentences. So I realised that I used humour to get out of a lot of tricky situations, and I couldn't do that anymore when I was speaking Dutch. So this was a little bit of a transition to cope with. But as I went along, I noticed that the Dutch are more direct in a certain way in their communications anyway, especially more direct than the Irish. We tend to be sort of circumlocutory, and in the original Irish language there's no word for no. So that tells you something about how people communicate. So Yeah, I discovered that says a lot about Dutch society, how people use language. That was very interesting.
And how do they use the language? Give an example if you can.
Well, I think, what would be a good example? I'll maybe say about the way I experienced it first is that the Irish would use language to entertain, to play with. The Dutch use language for communicating, tend to, not everybody's like this of course, but tend to use language just to communicate what they want to tell you about. There's no fiddling about and frilliness to it, or with most people. That has two sides to it as far as I'm concerned. There's, you know where you stand, which can be very useful sometimes with Irish people, or I think probably English are similar in that respect. They say something, you have to work out what exactly they're saying to you. The Dutch tend to be direct, and the other side of it is it tends, in my view, towards bluntness at times, which, if you're coming from another culture, can be a little bit confronting at first, and later as well, but yeah, it's a different use of language. Yeah, calling a spade a spade.
Yeah, so it's not unfriendly.
No, it's not intended as unfriendly at all, although a lot of people may experience it that way at first. It also, a lot of people experience it as arrogant, but it's not intended that way at all. It's just a different way of communicating.
Yeah, because some people find that the Dutch are very friendly, and some people find them really obnoxious. So it's really interesting how there's quite a wide variety.
If you're used to that kind of directness, you won't find the Dutch obnoxious, I think. If you're not, and as one client of mine who came from the south of the States, one of the southern states, she found that people were here really rude, really impolite. Yeah. And I thought, well, she told me a little bit about her background, and I could imagine that you would experience people here as being really impolite.
Yeah.
So.